Today, we're going to continue with a journey about how consumers make decisions by trying to understand a little bit better what attitudes are and what the underlying theories are for attitude formation and attitude change, and how those affect marketing communications. Okay. Now, first, let's start by saying how important attitudes are. Attitudes are something that consumers use on an ongoing basis to make their decisions on everyday life, both purchases, usages of products and services, and any other aspect of decision making more efficient, right? An attitude, what it does is essentially encompasses a holistic evaluation about a product or an object in general. We have attitude towards people, brands, ideas, etc. And what we do is we put into that basket everything that actually it's relevant regarding that object. So because attitudes are these overarching evaluations, they basically hold a lot of importance in consumer decision making, right? First, let's start by having some sort of basic definition of an attitude. An attitude is a pretty stable general evaluation of an object, okay? And by general evaluation, I'm just putting here everything that has balance, is either positive or negative, and that has been learned through experience over time. We have already discussed what consumer learning is, and what psychologically happens with learning is essentially a change of behavior, like we've seen, and there are different ways of achieving it. So because of this, attitudes hold a very important place when it comes down to behaviors, right? Because if we already have created a certain attitude, that's going to impact the kind of behaviors that we observe regarding that object, or in our case, mostly products and brands, right? What is an attitude object? Anything towards which we actually have an attitude. Like I said before, those could be products, they could be brands, they could be commercials, right? From a marketing perspective, but they could also be people and ideas, okay? Now, the first thing that I'm going to outline is some of the theories that discuss why attitudes actually exist, right? First, you have the utilitarian function, right? So this theory, what it says is attitudes exist because there are both punishments and rewards that actually are experienced by consumers and people in general. And one way of encapsulating this information, it's going to be the attitude. So that's going to enable us to remember what has worked in the past in providing us a positive reward or help us avoid a negative punishment. Okay. So this is a very obviously functional attitude theory. And if you remember our learning discussions, this relates to operant conditioning, right? Where you decide to do something and you change your behavior based on what it is that you're going to get out of it, or you're going to fail to receive, like in the case of a punishment, right? Good. The value expression function is a little bit different, and it basically looks at another portion that we have discussed before, which is motivation and values, right? And the idea behind this is these attitudes are essentially going to be expressions of our underlying values and what we consider our self-concept to be, or our personality. Okay, so the way we're going to express the values that we have already held, maybe we have developed or been inculcated over the years, is going to be through the attitudes that we are going to express. So this is not based so much in rewards and punishments as it is in core values that you have actually added to your belief system. Okay. Another slightly different but not so different perspective is the ego defensive function, where basically these attitudes are created to protect ourselves from external threats and potential mismatch between our self-ego and what the rest of the people, the groups that we are part of, say about us or act regarding to us. So what we're doing is we're trying to basically protect our internal feelings and how we feel about ourselves. Okay, so that's another way in which we create attitudes. And then finally, you have the knowledge function, which is essentially looking at how, at the end of the day, we need to keep this internal consistency between our feelings, ideas, and the rest of the world. So to achieve that, what we do is we create structure around us, right? So these are 4 different perspectives and attitudes. One thing that I'm pretty clear about, I hope, is that we really don't know empirically which one of these theories are actually right. If you look at the literature on attitudes, there are literally thousands of papers that empirically test some of these theories. And what we know as consumer researchers is that under some conditions, these attitudinal models actually work. But to have a holistic understanding of attitudes, we cannot just look at one model or one theory about attitudes, because they cannot explain everything that is true about attitudes or that we have found true empirically. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a lot of these different explanations about how attitudes are created, how they work, how they are changed. Okay, and what you need to realize that is that sometimes one of the models is going to work better than others. It's going to depend on context. It's going to depend on the situation, essentially. Okay. So first, let's start by talking about the different components of attitudes, right? Attitudes are complex, and they have at least 3 distinct components associated with it. Okay, the first one is affect. We have already discussed affect, so you already know what it is. It's essentially the way a consumer feels about the particular object that attitude is created towards. Okay, and this could be obviously positive or negative. So remember, affect is a balance element, so it could display either a positive element or a negative element. It could also be technically neutral, right? Or you just exactly don't know. But for the most part, you're going to have either a positive or a negative affect associated with the object. Okay. Then there is going to be the behavioral aspect of the attitude, which is going to be the action or actions that you tend to undertake towards that object. Okay. And then finally, you have the cognitive aspects associated with attitude, which is a set of beliefs that you have created and adopted regarding that object. Okay, and these 3 distinct aspects, everybody that studies attitudes acknowledges that they exist, but there is no clear theory that explains which one of these aspects happens first. And what we're going to see is that depending on the situation and depending on some of the variables, like for example involvement that we have discussed already, you're going to see that some of these components seem to appear first in the consumer's decision-making process. So let's discuss a little bit more about that. So here you have the idea of hierarchy of effects, right? So depending on an external variable, which is involvement, which we have discussed in the past, is essentially how important that either product, object, or thing is to the consumer in a given situation, because involvement could be situational. It could change because of the decision that I'm facing, not necessarily only based on the object. You're going to have a different hierarchy of effects, meaning which one of these 3 components actually shows first is going to be at least, and probably more things too, but at least a function of how involved you are with that object. Okay, so in high levels of involvement situations, what we're going to do is we're going to usually do a more careful problem-solving approach. We have already discussed this, right? In a situation like that, what we tend to do is we tend to think first, then feel, and then do. Okay, so first the belief component of the attitude will arise. Then after that, we will develop some affect, and then after that, we will actually go ahead and complete our behavior, which may mean in our case buying something or maybe not buying something, using something or not using something. Okay, now that order, think first, feel later and do next, it's not always maintained. It depends, again, on the level of involvement. In a low involvement situation, which is situations where we usually have weak preferences about objects, in our case about products or brands, the way we go about things is a little bit different, okay? I don't think this is right. So graphically, I'm gonna go over the same thing. In a low involvement process, we start with thinking about the problem, okay? But then instead of creating some sort of knowledge structure that guides our affect, how we feel about for example, if we're trying to buy gum, right? How we feel about the different brands of gum and the different flavors of gum. What we do is we just go from cognition, which could be I want to get some gum, right? That's our problem that we're thinking about, to go ahead and grab the gum, right, directly from the shelf, right? That will be a behavior. And then afterwards, I create the affect structure. So then I decide what it is that I like or I don't like based on what I've already picked, okay? So in a situation like this, usually because I don't have strong preferences, I just go ahead and grab something, and then I kind of tell myself a story of why what I grab actually makes sense, right? And I can create a positive attitude based on my behavior, essentially, okay? Good. The component being the affect, of course. Good. And then you have experiential, which is a little bit different. It's not necessarily high involvement or low involvement. It's a different variable that basically talks about the contextual situation, right? Where people are essentially driven to something because they are attracted to it. They have positive affect associated with them. It could be people, but for us, we're talking mostly about brands and products. And then based on that attractiveness that we feel, we go ahead and do the action. The action could be buy the product, use the product, dispose of the product if the affect is negative, okay? And after that, what we do is we rationalize why we did what we did, okay? So what we're doing is we're giving ourselves a logical explanation for our behaviors after the fact. So first comes the affect, then the behavior, and then, we rationalize our purchase. This is usually something that happens in hedonic consumption situations. Remember, hedonic consumption is when we're doing it mostly for our own pleasure or enjoyment. This is not a base necessity. Okay, so in situations like that, oftentimes you see this affect first. So first we have this impulse or incline to do something, then we act on it, and then after that we create some sort of story that is logical and based on cognition that enables us to basically maintain our internal consistency because of the actions that we engage in. Now, like I was saying before, there are, under different circumstances, different models that explain how those attitudes are created. We're going to talk about a few of them. There are more in the literature, but given that this is an introductory class, we're going to touch upon a few of these models that explain how attitudes are created. Okay, let's start at the bottom, right? So attitudes can have different levels of commitment, right? How determined we are to maintain that attitude in our value system, okay? And this commitment tends to be also correlated with involvement. Okay, so usually at the lowest levels of commitment, which usually tend to be attitudes associated with products that we have low involvement with. Okay, so these two concepts, commitment and involvement, they seem to be really closely related, even though they are different. Okay, what we have is we have attitudes that we form because of the external either rewards or punishments that are associated with them. Okay, so this could be, for example, attitudes that were formed towards speeding, right? I mean, maybe we don't have a strong reason to think that speeding it's a big deal in cars, but because there are fines associated with speeding, then we go ahead and comply with the speeding. It's not because we feel very strongly about it, right? So in a situation like this will be low commitment attitudes, right? Something that could potentially change maybe easily. When we talk about change, attitude will not change later, right? Then you have mid-level attitudes in terms of their level of commitment, and those will be what the textbook calls identification attitudes. And these are attitudes that are usually formed because we want to be part of a certain group, right? That group could be your family, could be your groups of buddies or friends, and it could be because you want to belong to a particular club, right? So these are attitudes that are, because of that, probably more important to us than it will be the lowest level that we were discussing before, and because we want to belong to the group and we want to maintain our, let's say, good standing status within that group. So now suddenly these attitudes are more important, and they're probably not going to be as easy to change. Okay, so this is what we call identification process, right? Where to identify with the group and to be part of the group, we are going to help, or maybe sometimes change some of our attitudes and then maintain them like that, right? So if you want to be part of the Sierra Club, maybe you cannot drive a gas guzzling SUV, right? Maybe before you didn't have strong attitudes about cars, but now suddenly your attitude when it comes to a certain category of cars becomes, let's say, more committed, right? And then at the highest level of commitment, we have attitudes that are essentially part of our core value system. These are attitudes that are held very strongly by people because these values are what dictate how we basically engage with the world, right? And because of that, they might be hard to change. In fact, they might, in some cases, not change even if there is strong punishments or rewards associated with them. Okay. So yeah, the level of commitment or attitude is going to be important because as marketers, sometimes we're going to try to persuade people, and trying to change somebody's attitudes associated with values might actually be very difficult or almost impossible. So we really need to understand what kind of attitudes we are actually dealing with. Okay. Now, in general, there is this effect that we find, regardless of the model that you try to use, which is the consistency principle. And this is essentially the idea that we are trying to keep this internal state of happiness or homeostasis that we have already discussed before. So because of that, what we try to do is we try to make sure that the different components of the attitudes are consistent between them. Remember, we have three components. We have the affect, okay, we have the behavior, and then we have the beliefs. So what this says is for you to be psychologically happy with yourself, these three aspects or components need to be in line. Otherwise, you're going to have to change some of them. Okay. So this idea is the principle of consistency. You want to make sure that your affect, your behavior, and your beliefs are all in the same direction. And if one of these changes, like maybe you start behaving in a way that is inconsistent with the other two, you either need to change your beliefs and affect, or you need to change your behavior. Okay. And this idea of consistency principle is very similar or very closely associated with cognitive dissonance, we have already discussed in the past. Okay, now we're going to discuss some of the theories that explain how attitudes are actually formed. Okay, the first one is self-perception theory, and what this essentially says is the attitudes are a reflection of my behavior. So what I do is I observe myself, I'm just paying attention to what I'm doing, and based on what I see that I'm doing, I just create attitudes that are consistent, following the consistency principle that we were discussing before, that are consistent with that behavior. Okay, so because of this, and if this theory is true, and it is true to some degree, I think some of the attitude formation can be explained by the different theories. This is why I was saying in the beginning we need to understand them all. This is, for example, used heavily in the sales literature. So if you're trying to come up with techniques that work for sales, if people form attitudes based on behavior, maybe you can leverage that to have them do something that maybe they were not planning on doing to begin with. Okay. By the way, some of these techniques might actually be considered deceptive or hard sell techniques, and because of that, if you are a traditional salesperson, maybe you're okay with it. Me being more of a, I don't know if I want to say new marketer. I don't know if new is the right word, because marketing has moved away from a lot of these hard selling techniques for years, which, they're still used in some industries. They are effective, but I am not sure that they are ethically advisable. I wouldn't advise them. So let me discuss a couple of these. For example, foot in the door technique, which is essentially when you first ask somebody to do something small and they actually do it, they are more likely to do something big afterwards, right? So for example, if you're trying to convince somebody to buy a car that maybe they are not convinced to buy, maybe what you can have them do is first have them do something that they think is small, and because of that, they're just going to do it. Like, for example, fill out a form with their information. So what that's going to do is it's going to make them more likely to trust you, right? Because the first task that they completed, was a small task and it was essentially no big deal, but they went ahead and did it. And now the following task that it's requested from them, they are going to be more likely to complete it as well. Right? So you can use this technique to basically little by little ask the consumer to do things that are bigger or farther away from maybe the level of comfort, and get them to do something that maybe otherwise they wouldn't have done. Like I said, whether this is ethically correct, I don't think so. Okay. Or you can do the opposite. Door in the face technique, right? And the idea with that is, first you have a request that is outrageous, that nobody will agree to, okay, and they are going to tell you no about it. But after that, you request something that is maybe a little bit more reasonable. And because of the contrasting effect between the first no and the next thing that you're asking, people are more likely to actually agree to the second thing. Like, for example, if you want to, I don't know, if you want a girl to agree to go on a first date with you, but you think that maybe they agree to that, but not to give you their telephone number, I don't know. Then what you can do is you ask them first for the telephone number. When they say no, you say, okay, fine. You don't want to give me your telephone number, I understand. But what about going to coffee right now? They might actually be okay with that. Right? So this idea of door in the face technique is you do something first that it's maybe a for sure no, in the hopes that, the next request, which is going to be more reasonable, they are just, going to agree to, because they see the difference. They see how, oh yeah, he was unreasonable first, but now he's more reasonable. I don't know if I should be giving you guys dating advice though. Sorry. Okay. Another theory that explains also how attitudes are formed is social judgment theory, right? Which basically says that we are likely to either assimilate or reject information that comes our way based on our original attitudes or feelings, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take our original or initial attitude as a frame of reference, right? That's going to be like, let's say, for example, I don't know, I like chocolate, right? So that's my original attitude, right? And I'm going to use that as a frame of reference to decide whether any information that comes my way is going to be either accepted and used to further bolster my attitude towards, in this case, chocolate, because it's me, right? Or you're going to use it to reject that information. Like, for example, there's a new study coming that says that chocolate's really good for you because it has antioxidants in it. At least dark chocolate, that's what they'll say, right? So what it does is it bolsters my positive attitude towards chocolate. So I'm going to just reference that study whenever somebody tells me that I shouldn't be eating so much chocolate, which is probably true, right? So my behavior is eat a lot of chocolate. That will be part of my attitude towards chocolate, right? And the frame of reference that I'm using is my positive attitude. So when study comes my way that says chocolate's great because it has some antioxidant properties, it's like one more reason to eat chocolate. On the other hand, if there is a study that shows that people that eat a lot of chocolate are more likely to have type 2 diabetes, because most chocolate comes together with sugar, not just cocoa, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, yeah, but those are probably older people, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically reject that information and not assimilate the information, okay? So contrast effect is the effect of, when your attitude is positive and the information is negative, that contrast makes you reject the attitude, and assimilation effect is the opposite. When they are both of the same balance, like for example, when you feel negatively about something and a negative piece of information comes, you are more likely to put it together because it's consistent. So I hope you guys are realizing that we are trying to keep this internal consistency about attitudes and behaviors at all time. Why? Because we need to live with ourselves, right? If you think one thing and do another, that's hard. So social judgment theory builds on this idea about how attitudes are formed by keeping this consistency. Okay. Good. And then you have balance theory, which in a way is similar, right? But this is talking more about the balance of the attitudes as opposed to any other informational aspect of it. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move to the next slide because I think it's easier to see this story based on the diagram. Okay, so balance theory essentially tells you that if you're in a situation where you have three aspects, at least three, that are in some sort of incongruent balance, what you're going to do is you're going to have to change the balance such that that incongruency disappears. Okay, so for example, imagine that you're in college, right? And you like a gentleman called Dan, right? And one day he shows up with an earring, right? And he didn't have an earring before. So assume that for you, earrings are not particularly attractive in gentlemen, right? So you have this triad right here, right? You have this, the way you feel about Dan and the way you feel about the earring in a way that it's inconsistent, right? If you were to like earrings, this wouldn't be a problem. The fact that Dan comes with an earring makes you more likely to like Dan and everybody's happy. But that's not the way it is at this point, right? So in a situation like this, you're going to have to restore the consistency of this triad of balances, okay? You could maybe dislike Dan, that would be the first option. Or you could just change your attitude towards earrings, right? Or maybe you can try to convince Dan to drop the earring, right? So that you don't have to worry about it. And you can maintain both of the other attitudes together, right? So balance theory, again, is speaking about the principle of consistency by looking at it only from the judgmental aspect, okay?